Well, welcome back, those of you who attended our first webinar, and welcome to those of you who are attending your first Ambassador Program webinar. So today's presentation is a two-parter. We're going to blend it all together, but we'll take a little break because I'm going to show you a cool tool that you'll be able to use wherever you are in the world even. So first, though, what we're going to talk about is migration. And so my little fun title for this first part of the presentation, Support Local, is in support your local birds, which means you need to find out what your local birds are. So in North America, for those of us who are in North America, we see a difference in birds from east to west, north to south, habitat to habitat. And so knowing where you are, knowing place, can then help you to know your birds. And knowing then, are they a resident species? Are they a migratory species? Are they an eruptive species? Knowing all these things can be really useful for bird feeding, especially if you're trying to attract certain kinds of birds, or maybe you're just wondering why all of a sudden there are a lot more birds of one species than others. Knowing these things can be really beneficial. Real quick, for those who didn't attend last time, just quick about me. So day job is with an international bird conservation group. This is also my hobby, my passion, my fun. And then on the side, I run flockingaround.com. So some resources to learn your local birds, field guides, whether you're a Sibley person because you like the drawings, or if you like photos, Crossley guides are a great guide, very useful. They do cost money, but still very useful. You want some free resources, Merlin, which is a smartphone app, great resource for learning local birds. All About Birds, which is a website that's through Cornell Lab of Ornithology. eBird, which is a great data resource, and we're going to use that tool later on in this presentation. And then your local bird clubs, whether that's an Audubon Society, an ornithological society, just a local bird watching club, whatever it is, tapping those resources to learn more about your local birds, if you don't already know about them, is great. Okay, so let's jump in to resident and migratory species and talk a little bit about each. So when you are looking at a range map, and we're going to see a few here in just a little bit, when you're looking at a range map, you'll see that some species, they only have maybe one color across their range map, and that color indicates that they're there year round. Now we would call this a resident species, meaning that no matter the time of year, that species is present in that area. Now it's hit and miss. It's not when you're drawing a range map, it's a very broad, category to apply. And sometimes birds that are in one part of the range, they're not the same individuals as then maybe in a different season. So maybe during one part of the season, you have, say, an American robin. And so maybe in summer, you have your breeding American robins. Well, when winter comes, you might have an entirely different set of American robins that winter near you. It depends on if you're in an area where robins are residents or not. So for me in Wyoming, robins are here all year, but the ones we have in wintertime are different individuals than the ones that we have in summertime. Now, the species here is considered a resident because it can be found year round, but the individuals are not. So, understand there is some variability within these definitions, and they're used, to loosely apply across the landscape. So examples of species that might have, might be residents wherever you are. Chickadees are a great one, whether you live in black-capped chickadee territory or Carolina chickadee territory or chestnut or boreal, whatever it is, your chickadees are likely year-round residents. Whatever the species is, they're probably there much of the time. Same for jays, blue jays, Steller's jays, although sometimes Steller's jays will move up and down in elevation depending upon the season. Scrub jays, whatever your jays, they're likely there all year. Same for nuthatches, although nuthatches can be eruptive, meaning that all of a sudden in one area, there'll be a lot more nuthatches than usual. And then in other areas, there might be a lot fewer. And we'll talk about what eruptions are in a little bit. Woodpeckers are another great one, and then certain finches can be residents. So migration, what is a migratory species? Well, a migratory species is a species that participates within migration, right? Migration is part of its annual life cycle. And so Migration, it's a regular seasonal movement of individuals away from and then back to, that's a big part, back to the breeding grounds. Because oftentimes you'll have what's called dispersal. Young birds will disperse and they don't return back to maybe that same spot. So dispersal is not really the same thing as migration. And then there's other various forms where birds will just move, they're wanderers. So what triggers migration? You know, a lot of times we hear, well, it's the weather. And weather's probably one of the lower to lowest aspects of what actually triggers migration. For most species, it's actually the photo period, or just the length of day, the amount of light that the birds are exposed to during the day. And that will drive so much of their biological function, whether it's breeding or migration or telling their body it's time to feed a lot more, you know, building up fat stores, whatever it is. Some birds have a genetic predisposition to know when it's time to migrate. Food availability. Some birds will migrate further in certain years than in other years because of food availability, which is tied then to weather. So the weather is not impacting the bird directly, but it might impact their food availability. So all of these things can help to trigger and then control, you know, how far a migration might go. And there's varying forms of migration, you know, depending upon the species and, you know, the population. And so there's a lot of variables in this. And this is very broad just to give you a picture of migration. So where do these birds go? Well, it depends. Depends on where you live. Some birds, for some of us, are year-round residents, whereas for others, they're not. So if you live in Canada, most of your robins, especially if you live, you know, anywhere close to, you know, north central part of Canada, they're gone for the winter. But here where I am, they're here all year. So it differs. It also differs on the species. You know, one hummingbird species might only go to the Gulf Coast, whereas others might go down into Mexico and Central America. It depends on food availability. Yellow rump warblers are known to winter, you know, and varying levels of, you know, how far south they go, depending upon how, you know, much flying insect food material is available to them. So what's the food availability? That's a big control factor on you know, where they're going and where they're going to stop for the time. Because some birds, they'll go to an area, but they're not going to spend their entire time there. So when we think of migration, you know, most folks know about going north to south, although if you experience what we call austral migrants, which guess what, even in the southern hemisphere, they have migratory birds as well. Those birds kind of do a reverse. Some of them migrate north for, you know, their quote unquote winter, okay? So they kind of have that reverse aspect of what we experience in the northern hemisphere. But birds can migrate north to south, east to west, west to east. They can migrate up or down in altitude, you know, elevation. So in wintertime, you know, in harsh mountain environments, some of those birds will move down and then will move back up as those conditions improve. And then sometimes you'll just have random movements of birds that are dependent upon very specific things, usually food related. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Some examples of migratory birds. Well, the one staring at you right now, obviously, red-winged blackbird, it is a migratory species, but not for everyone. Depends on who you are and where you live. Some others, though, warblers, which is not common feeder bird for most of us, but still a bird that is, you know, very much beloved by the feeding crowd. Hummingbirds, very migratory. Not all species, but a large percentage. Nuthatches, but not all nuthatches are migratory. Some stay, you know, their residence wherever their population is. So again, you'll see there's going to be, you know, variability within each of these. There's going to be an exception to every single rule that I give you. There's always going to be an exception. Woodpeckers are not migratory, except for some are. So you'll notice they were on both lists. There's a reason. Sapsuckers, very migratory. Lewis's woodpecker, very migratory. But then hairy and downy, very residential. In fact, individuals at the individual level, they're very residential. So you can see it, you know, so you'll see there's several on each list because a lot of birds, depending on which species we're talking about and your geography, where you're located, determines is it a migratory bird or not. Okay, so I said we talk about eruptions. So eruptions. This is where really when we're talking bird feeding, it becomes exciting because for those that feed birds, eruptions bring large numbers of maybe often unusual species. Not for everyone. Some folks experience pine siskins and red-breasted nuthatches all year, but then for others, all of a sudden you get several hundred pine siskins filling your feeders for the course of the winter because there's an eruption in your area. And so it happens in a lot of different species, but the ones often highlighted are finches. In fact, there is a finch forecast network that actually forecasts which finches are going to erupt when and where. And they're pretty good about it because they are measuring the food source on the breeding grounds of these populations. Nuthatches, also known for it, specifically red-breasted nuthatches, although white-breasted will erupt occasionally. And then owls. You'll often hear about it with snowy owls. Snowy owls showing up in Hawaii or Florida, places where snowy owls don't typically exist. All of a sudden, there's a snowy owl there. So eruptions can happen, and it's usually tied to food availability. The pine siskin is a great example in that in some years, the pine siskins will stay up, the large population in the boreal will stay up in the boreal, and then in other years, they will evacuate many parts of the boreal and invade all across the central part of North America for the wintertime. And so this is an animation provided by eBird, which shows how the abundance of pine siskins might look over the course of a given year. So this starts on January, the first week of January, and runs to the end of December. So we're starting in January. You can see in this year, at this winter time, they're not very far south in great numbers, but by the following winter, that might change. So let's see if it'll play. Oh. Okay, so March, April, May, June, July, so we're to summer. Now we're coming into fall, and watch what happens by December. Large numbers shifting south. And so, you'll see varying levels. Where they go depends upon where there's food available. It really differs year to year. This is, a very probably an average across multiple years. It looks like 06 to 2020. So, kind of predicting that it's not always easy, but for finches, there is a forecast network. And I think sometimes they even do non-finches. So other species that can erupt: evening grosbeaks, crossbills, pine grosbeaks, rosy finches, with siskins, redpolls, a lot of the finches, and they try to forecast for a lot of those. Okay, so resident versus migratory, we kind of already talked about this. There can be a population level distinction in that in some areas, like for instance, this is a red crossbill on the screen. Red crossbills here, our population generally stays in this area unless there's no cone crop, and then they move. But then they're not migrating out of this area most years because they have a food source here all year. So, it really differs depending on where you're at, which is why the title of this was, support local, meaning learn your local birds and learn what they do. And I'll show you a tool that can help you to do that. So, learning those local birds. So I'm gonna show you some examples of birds that are different east to west, and then also how then their residency patterns are different east to west. And then we're gonna go into this eBird tool. So this is a Cassin's finch, just in case you did not know that. It's not a purple finch, it's a Cassin's finch. Cassin's finch range looks like this. So for much of the Rocky Mountain, Intermountain West, you can see the Cassin's finch, that purple, that its population is fairly residential. However, in the areas that are red, those areas really only seem to experience it during the breeding season. And in the areas in blue, they see Cassin's finches in wintertime when their populations might have to spread out a little bit because of food availability. Now, they're not a more traditional migration map of what we would see on a warbler, where a warbler would, breed in Canada and then migrate down into Central and South America. But it's a common feeder bird for those of us in the Intermountain West. For the rest of the country, you have a bird that looks very similar. You have a purple finch. So what does the purple finch do? So the purple finch, you can see throughout much of its northern part of its range, it breeds across the boreal in Canada and then leaves that area and winters in much of southern parts of the US. So you might see purple finches for much of the winter and then very few to none for the rest of the year. That's because it's a little bit different than how it was for the Cassin's finch, except look at the West Coast. That purple on the West Coast, purple finches, it's a different population. They're residents along the West Coast. So it really differs depending upon the population that you're referring to. Another couple that can look similar. This is a broad-tailed hummingbird, not a ruby-throated hummingbird. So what does it look like? Well, it's a more typical migration map. It summers in the north and then winters in southern Mexico and Central America. But you'll notice it has some areas of semi-residency or full residency, just depending on where you're at on the range map. But again, once summer's over, typically you're going to see it leaving. Now during migration, that yellow kind of shows areas where they'll wander, as they're following the bloom south for the fall. So for the ruby-throated hummingbird, going to be a different map. Summers throughout eastern North America, and then you can see very little to no areas of residency, although probably some areas of residency along the Gulf Coast where feeders are out all winter, and so they might experience some ruby-throated hummingbirds year-round as long as conditions don't become too harsh for them, but then they winter down in southern Mexico and northern Central America. Now, the rufous hummingbird is an interesting one because some parts of the country only see rufous hummingbirds for one season instead of a spring migration, a fall migration, or maybe you get them in summer or winter. They're very different, and that rufous hummingbirds in the spring, they actually migrate north along the Pacific coast. But in the fall, they'll bypass that and they'll migrate down the Rockies and follow the bloom of the montane flowers of the Rocky Mountains. And then you can see they kind of winter all across the Gulf Coast in small numbers, and then they have their major wintering areas in northern Mexico and southern Mexico. And so, these three hummingbirds all use kind of different strategies and also move differently, within their own migration. And so I do this to remind you that, learning your local birds is critical because, if you're wondering, well, why don't I ever get purple finches at my feeders? Well, there might be a reason. If you're not putting food out in the wintertime, or say, you live in this area versus that area, there's some areas where just purple finches, you're not going to experience them. So learning your local birds, using the free resources that I shared, all of the resources that I shared that were free, they all have range maps that are useful. So this is where I'm going to stop with the PowerPoint, and I'm going to show you some quick eBird functions for those of you who have never had the chance to use it before. So I'm going to stop showing that screen, and I'm going to show this screen. Okay, so what we've got here, we had some folks from Oregon last time, so I used Oregon just as the whole state. You can go down to very small levels, very specific hotspots, your county, just whatever you have. The data will change depending upon how much data has been input for your local area. So the whole state of Oregon has a good number of checklists. So this is a pretty good representation of, if you're looking for pine siskins, when you should expect them. Now, there's different tabs here. And so the way I got to this real quick though, you go to Explore. I'll show you how to walk through this. So you click on the Explore tab in eBird. You click on bar charts. Find your state that you want to do. You can do entire region. You could do a county. I'm going to do entire region. And then it pulls this up. Now, I'll do a quick thing. So then right here, that's kind of where that other data is hidden. It's in this little line. You'll see the highlighted pine siskin row. And you can just try to look at these two, but that's not as helpful because it's fairly uniform going across. So you click the little line chart there, open up this, and then you've got these tabs. And this is where we want to get real specific. We want to find abundance. And so this is an average across all checklists submitted during, these are split up by week by week, during that period, that time frame, how many birds were being seen. Now, if you want maybe a different number, you could look at totals, or you could look at average count. So this means for each checklist where a pine siskin was observed, this is how many were counted on each checklist. So looking at this average count, then we can see, okay, the best time, if you're in Oregon, again, very broad, because that's a big state, the best time to see a pine siskin, it's going to be probably when that average count is at its highest, which is about 21 birds per checklist on the week, the second week of October, basically. You can see it starts to really rise once you get closer to October. Basically, that last week of September, numbers start to shoot up, and then by second week of October, you're seeing 21 birds per checklist, versus if you're trying to, if you're wondering, well, why don't I have so many pine siskins in the summertime at my feeders? Well, it could be due to a lot of reasons, but also because of bird movement, migration, things like that. So you can see on June 1st, you might only see maybe 3 pine siskins if you're in an area where pine siskins are being seen, versus once you hit October, 21 birds per checklist. That's a lot. And a lot of that probably does have to do with the birds are congregating at feeders, and really, it makes it a lot easier to count them when they're doing that. So this is a useful tool you can use to find out what birds are doing in your areas and when. And so you can go across, and if you want to learn about what each of these terms mean, you can click on this and it'll open a tab, and it'll explain the definition of what frequency is versus abundance, etc. And you can do it for a variety of birds. So if you want to say, let's do evening grosbeak, another one. This can be an eruptive one. So best time of year to see evening grosbeaks. We could look at frequency. It's not my favorite. I prefer abundance or average count, and that gives us a better picture. So you can see up until basically May starts and after September starts. So from September to May, that's when you're most likely to be experiencing evening grosbeaks in an area where they're likely to be seen. Because again, this total, or this average count, excludes the checklists that were submitted that don't have any evening grosbeaks on them whatsoever. So if you're in an area where evening grosbeaks are likely to be seen, you can see this is about how many you'd see during that time, anywhere from looks like 6 to close to 15. So September through May in Oregon, that's your best chance to see an evening grosbeak. And again, likely because they're coming into feeders because of the food availability supplementing their diet. So it's very, very useful. Okay, so that's just a tool, and we don't have time, to really dig into that tool a lot. But if you have more questions about it, we'll have our contact info up at the end, and you can reach out with specific questions about it. If you want like a walkthrough tutorial, we can discuss that at another time. But just, it's a tool that can be used to help you understand your local birds, and that's what this presentation is all about. So okay, so let's talk about then, let's say, okay, you've learned about those birds, but field guides don't always explain how to attract them. So let's talk about the art of attraction of birds. So drawing in very specific birds to your yard, to your feeder. A lot of people just will put out a feeder and throw whatever seed they can buy cheap, and whatever they get, and they're happy with that, and that's great. But sometimes maybe you want the colorful birds like this Bullock's oriole, or a Baltimore oriole, or a lazuli bunting, indigo bunting, northern cardinal, blue jay. You want the splashes of color that maybe aren't as easy to attract as, say, a house sparrow or something like that. So, and these are very broad. These are very, very broad. You might have a species or a population that does things very different wherever you're at than, say, those on the East Coast or those on the West Coast. Just, it all comes down to the birds in your area can be doing very different things than the birds in someone else's area. So these are going to be very broad, very general suggestions for how to attract certain birds. So keep that in mind, because we're speaking to a very broad audience, not only those who are watching right now, but those who are watching the recorded version of this. If you have questions about specific birds, feel free to send them over, and I can provide tips on how to do it, and not just assumptions or anecdotes. I can provide researched evidence on this is a main food source for this bird, so here's either the way to utilize that food source, or here is the best representation of that food source that is available within the bird feeding industry. So let's start with some of my favorites: nuthatches and woodpeckers. So the biggest foods that I see them appreciating, and again, there will be others that they will use. I've seen woodpeckers shoving their tongue down into a hummingbird feeder and lapping up nectar. Okay, so I can't, we can cover them all, but then that's less useful. If you want the top ways to attract these types of birds, suet is one of the best. Woodpeckers and nuthatches, especially in wintertime. Summertime, they will back off of it a little bit in many places, not in all, but suet, especially in fall, winter, spring, it will get hammered by nuthatches and woodpeckers if you have them in your area. Sunflower seed, especially black gold sunflower seed, it's a big thing for them because of the fats and the protein. Fats and protein, that's some of the big stuff, especially in the wintertime when birds are consuming a lot of their fats just to keep their bodies warm, just for heating themselves. They need that fat restoration, so they really appreciate having suet and sunflower, two things that can help them keep those fat stores well supplied. So using those two foods are two great ways to attract nuthatches and woodpeckers. What do you put them in? Well, you can use a typical suet cage. You can use the realistic, log, where you just cut a log and drill the holes in it and shove the, some suet plugs, or chunk up your suet and smash it in. What I see is they really appreciate not the port tubes. If you remember last week, if you were here, we talked about tube feeders, but the mesh tubes. You can see this nuthatch is on a mesh tube. One of the reasons is because they can hang on it a little bit and sit. They don't like to sit horizontally nearly as much as they like to sit, in that vertical arrangement or orientation. So having the mesh feeders gives them something to cling on to easy. Now, it's not to say they won't use the others, because I see them on my platform feeders regularly. It's just, these are the types of ones where it's easy for them to fly in quick, attach to the mesh, pull one seed out, fly back up, and either then they'll cache it or they'll break it open and eat it. They'll shove it into a crack and bark and split it open. So platforms and hoppers also work, but definitely suet, something that holds the suet would be first recommendation, and then something that can hold black gold sunflower seed, which we talked about last week, would be next recommendation. So juncos and sparrows, they're small billed. Juncos and sparrows have small bills, especially when you compare them to finches. So they prefer small billed foods. Millet and milo. In fact, juncos are not regularly hopping up on feeders around here. Usually they're on the ground, but I have this millet that's in a feeder, and you can see this junco is sitting during the middle of a blizzard on this millet feeder because the ground is covered with snow, and so it's able to get this millet off this feeder. They like the small seeded things because of their bill size. It really helps them to be able to crack it open a little bit better. If you're going to use sunflower or corn, using the crushed heart sunflower or cracked corn, where it's in smaller pieces, a little bit easier for them than to break up, into a piece that they can consume, because those big pieces are a little bit harder for these small birds to consume. And then I've seen them also cleaning up or sitting on Niger feeders, eating Niger, which is usually used to attract finches, but small billed birds like sparrows, juncos, towhees, they also like that Niger because it's a nice small seed that's easy for them to crack open with their bill. So what kind of feeders for these birds? Well, sparrows are mostly ground birds. So having large perches, even though they're a small bird, having large perches, because they don't like to sit in those narrow spaces. They will, and I'm not saying they won't, and it depends on what kind of sparrow. Chipping sparrows will use a tube feeder with ports, whereas some sparrows won't. So like a Lincoln sparrow, something like that, might not appreciate that as much, or certain types of juncos with really big heads, they might not like that as much. So my general recommendation is, a platform ground feeder, something that is big enough for them to get into and feel supported by, because again, they're a ground dwelling species. That's what their, preferred arrangement is to be, on something solid, especially, nice big area for them to sit down in while they're eating. And sometimes they'll just clean up your feeders underneath. So whatever you're putting out, they'll help to clean up underneath. Again, very general application of this, just trying to get you started in the right direction. If you have questions about specific birds, you can throw it in the questions and comments. However, even though I didn't recommend it, you'll also see birds that, they'll just throw out all the rules. And I have juncos that regularly now sit on the suet and consume the suet right out of the cage until the woodpecker comes and chases them off, right? But during certain conditions, so obviously you can see there's snow here, big blizzard, multiple feet of snow, juncos could not forage on the ground. So then they really appreciated having these areas where they could fly up, and you can see their discomfort level trying to use a suet feeder, because woodpeckers, nuthatches, they have grasping feet specifically built for grasping onto things. Juncos have those perching feet, especially for the ground. They're more, they run across the ground, they hop across the ground. Their feet aren't that type of strong that helps them to hold their body weight, when they're clinging to something that sits vertically. So this is not their favorite, but they will do it. So, don't think, well, I can't put that out because it won't attract this. No, having a variety can help, especially, during major storms. It always can seem to lure in unusual things. So chickadees, yeah.
We did have a question come through. Monique was wondering if offspring of residents stay in the area. I think she's coming from Florida.
So yeah, it depends on where you're at, but and depends on species. But usually offspring will stay for a while, and then they go through what's called a dispersal, where they just start to wander, and then they'll fill gaps wherever that they're not getting chased off by territorial birds. So it really depends on the species and where you're at, because some areas can host a lot more birds per acre because of food availability than others. If you're talking like something like a cardinal, well, in Florida, you've got, tons of that really thick vegetation, that cardinals love. Whereas in the Great Plains, if you try to find cardinals, they're very scattered. The density, of cardinal nests per acre or per hectare really, shrinks in the Great Plains versus in Florida, where they'll be nesting on top of each other practically. So it depends on where you're at, but in many places, yes, the young birds will stay at least somewhat local, but it may not be for long, because again, once they reach like maybe sexual maturity, they might get chased off, especially if they're a male. Their own father, if you will, the male of that area, that territory, might chase them off because they don't want competition. So really depends on the species in the area. But usually most chicks go through a dispersal where they start to scatter and wander and learn how to be their species to some effect. Great
you
question.
Touched on the cardinal, and she also mentioned the hawks, jays, and doves. Would that apply to them as well?
It will. And hawks will stay with their parents a lot longer. Raptors generally will. Raptors use a very concentrated approach in raising chicks, in that they'll focus on one or two chicks for a lot longer to ensure survival. Whereas songbirds, passerines, they'll use kind of what I call the shotgun method. And that's just like they lay as many eggs as they can, raise them up quick, and then scatter them out, right? Then just hoping something survives. They hope something hits the target, which is survival. Whereas raptors are kind of, a very focused, targeted approach. Passerines are just like, here's a bunch, good luck. So, it does depend. Jays will generally stay because you'll see jays in family units. Some birds form family units and will actually support each other. We have some grackles do this as well, where immature female grackles, maybe in their second year of life, if they don't have their own nest, they will actually help to raise the chicks of maybe the female that raised them. So you'll see that sometimes, where you'll see family units that form. It really just depends on species and where you're at. And that's not super helpful, but like if you're asking, about red-shouldered hawks, eventually those babies will be chased away, will be forced out by red-shouldered hawk parents because, sharing resources is difficult.
Perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so chickadees. So chickadees kind of similar to the nuthatches and woodpeckers in that chickadees have a really strong grip. And so they'll utilize a lot of feeders that, other birds maybe aren't as comfortable with because they don't have that grip. Chickadees' grip is really, really strong, especially considering, the size of the bird. They have quite the grip on them. So food that attracts them, they'll come into just about anything, but some of their favorites, black gold sunflower, suet, the fats again. They will also use Niger, and like I said, they'll come into almost anything, but those are the big ones that, if you have those, there will be a preference towards those first, depending upon time of year and what's in the suet. Sometimes they'll prefer some kinds of suet over others, depending upon what the main mixed in ingredient is. I'm missing peanuts on here too. They love, especially when the peanuts are crushed hearts, then they'll really love that as well. But yeah, I forgot to put peanuts on here, but peanuts are another big one. It's one of the reasons they like a lot of suets, because in many suets, that main ingredient is oftentimes crushed peanuts. So feeders, types that they can use, just about anything. Chickadees will use just about any kind of feeder. Again, if it's got a food that they want, they will come in and they will utilize it. So that's why chickadees are a very common feeder bird, and often one of the most seen feeder birds, because they'll use just about anything. Finches, some of the colorful birds that visit feeders, some of the most colorful birds that visit feeders, like these American goldfinch. Finches, they'll eat a variety of foods. Some finches only eat vegetative materials, meaning seeds. So like the American goldfinch usually has little to no animal matter in its diet, meaning insects. So it's mostly a seed-driven species. And so what is it like? Well, sunflower, Niger, you'll see it eating other small seeds, canary seed, things like that. The finch mixes will have other small things, small seed millet, things like that in it. So eat a variety of things. If you get a finch mix, you'll see them utilize it all. But Niger and sunflower are big ones that really, really attract them. But any of the small seeds, they'll also appreciate. It also depends on which finch you're trying to attract. Lesser goldfinch is a very small bird, and they would prefer the Niger over something like a sunflower seed that's not hulled, because their bills are so tiny. Cracking that big sunflower seed, it's a real chore to crack that bad boy open. Whereas the Niger seed, real quick and easy for them to crack it open, consume the seed, and keep going. And so something like a lesser goldfinch will prefer the Niger, whereas a larger finch, like an evening grosbeak, will bypass the Niger and go straight to the black gold sunflower seed. But evening grosbeak's got that big honking bill, that can crack those seeds open pretty easy. So going to depend upon the species. But if you put those two out, sunflower, Niger, or just a generalized finch food will attract the smaller finches. Sunflower will attract the larger finches. Just about any type of feeder that can hold those foods, those birds will utilize. Again, larger finches, they're going to prefer larger perch areas. So large birds, large perch. You think about that. Something like a rosy finch. Rosy finches are cliff dwellers. So they want large platforms to feed on. They don't like the tubes with the little perches and ports, because they're a big rock dweller. So they want big, flat, open areas to feed on. So if you get rosy finches where you're at, you're going to need a platform feeder or to feed on the ground. So cardinals. Now, when I say cardinals, I'm kind of also referring to the rest of the family. So that can be cardinals, grosbeaks, tanagers, buntings, anything within that family. So those are all related. These things can all attract them to some extent. Tanagers are harder because they prefer fruits. Although suet sometimes will attract tanagers. I get tanagers at my suet pretty regularly, but during migration, sometimes dried fruits or mealworms can also attract tanagers. But for the rest of the family, you can't go wrong with sunflower, corn, fruit, oats, things like that. If given a preference, a cardinal will choose sunflower over everything else almost every single time. Studies, show this. The majority of their diet, when given a preference, sunflower seed. In an area where it's being presented and being fed. In a wild setting, maybe not, but where it's an easy, accessible point, they will pick the sunflower regularly. And again, these are larger birds, so large perches are going to be best, whether it's a platform feeder, a hopper feeder, that has an ample perch area, or if you're going to use a tube one with ports, make sure it's got, big perches for them to sit on, because they're going to want that space. And again, ground feeders also work for these birds. So with jays, whether it's a blue jay, Steller's jay, scrub jay, or you go into the rest of the corvids, ravens and crows, peanuts. Peanuts are a big one for them. They love peanuts. You can see this Steller's jay is grabbing this peanut. It's got some cayenne pepper on it, which they actually really seem to enjoy having that added to it. And we'll talk about why it's added to this peanut in another webinar a few weeks from now. But peanuts are a big one for all the corvids. They almost all love peanuts quite a bit, but they will use sunflower. They will come into suet if they're especially needing those fats. My Steller's jays and many other jays, they have a real love for milo as well. One of the first images in this presentation actually was a Steller's jay with 5 pieces of milo shoved into its bill, and then it just swallowed them all back. They all just rolled on back into the back of the mouth and into the crop, like one of those games where, like a pinball game, right? When they all roll down the thing, or not pinball, skee ball. That's it. So it really just depends on where you're at, and they'll change up. But if you put out peanuts, it's one of the easiest ways to attract jays. Use peanuts. If you want jays, use peanuts. Now with jays, the big corvids, it does not have to be a shelled peanut, because they can very easily crack a peanut shell, and they will. But if you put it out, they'll consume. Well, they'll consume it a lot faster too. So you might get a lot more, and they might consume it a lot faster if it's shelled. So something to consider. With these large birds, again, large perch space. You got to have the perch space to make them feel comfortable. Now, it doesn't have to be completely stable. You can see this platform feeder here. It's on these steel cables, and so it wiggles when that big Steller's jay comes into land, and multiple don't like to land on it at once. This is about a medium-sized platform feeder, but as long as one can land, they will use it. But if you put a big, ground platform feeder out, something like that, they'll use it. They also make peanut rings, which gives the jays a little bit more of a challenge, although once they figure it out, then it's not a challenge at all. Then they're just going to clean you out. They'll clean those. They're called peanut wreaths or peanut rings, or something like that. No, it looks like a slinky that's been turned into a wreath shape, and then you stuff it with peanuts, and then they have to come and get them out. But it's not a challenge once they figure it out. They're smart birds. Corvids are the smartest birds, right? So they can figure it out real quick. Hummingbirds, hummingbirds are very selective. Easiest ways to attract them with foods, nectar, and then the natural way, the things that produce nectar, flowers. So using flowers to help lure them in to your feeders, complement your feeders and your flowers. It's a great way, because also what many people don't realize is that during much of the year, the main source of food for hummingbirds is actually going to be animal matter, bugs, whether it's flies or aphids or spiders. They eat a ton of insect matter, and they need that insect matter to help form their feathers, because nectar alone does not have all the macronutrients needed for those feathers to grow. So planting native plants that host native insects also creates an ample food source that otherwise is hard to reproduce through just feeding of nectar. So what do you use to hold nectar? Well, you use a hummingbird feeder, a nectar feeder. Pretty simple. Now, orioles and hummingbirds, they can both have similar feeders. There can be some small differences in them, like the size of the porthole. So just pay attention to which one you're getting. Usually, oriole feeders are orange, hummingbird feeders are red, because hummingbirds are attracted to that red coloration. You do not need to use red dyed hummingbird food. Just FYI, you don't need to use it. It does not help attract them any more than just having the red feeder does. With orioles, with their food, fruit, jelly, and just the plain, grape jelly, the regular grape jelly can work. But fruit jelly, so when I say fruit, cut oranges in half, and you can just nail them to something, and the orioles will come in and just sit on the orange and eat it. They love it. You can make nectar for orioles as well using an oriole nectar feeder. And then I also get them at suet quite a bit. You can see this one here. It's actually eating one that has pieces of orange, dried orange in it, and so they love coming into this one quite a bit. So what do you use to host all that? Well, they make hangers where you can hang the fruit up. You can also just, nail it to a board somewhere, nail it to a branch. Just be careful, of damaging your tree if you're going to nail things to your tree. They make jelly holders where you can put, the jelly inside of a little cup, and it hangs nicely for the orioles. And then orioles will use hummingbird feeders as well. The port's usually smaller, so it's harder for their larger tongues to get in to help lap up, but they will still utilize them. If you get an oriole feeder, generally they have a larger porthole. So warblers are one of those birds that I think we all wish we could get more of at our feeders, and it's really hard, right? It's not an easy thing to attract warblers because if you don't know, which is again, learning your local birds, right? Warblers are insectivores, not 100%, but mostly. Insects is almost exclusively what they eat. So getting them to your feeders is extremely difficult. So how do you do it? Well, suet is a great way, because if you've got some late season warblers that are having a hard time finding flying insects because of a cold snap, they will use suet to help restore fat stores for them for migration. I've seen them also eat hulled sunflower. They won't crack the shells, at least not regularly. They probably have done it a couple times, but it's not a regular thing. But they will eat bits of cracked, sunflower hearts. So the smashed up sunflower hearts can really help. But again, it's going to be hard to get them to either of these. Out of the thousands of birds and bird photos I have of birds at any of my feeders, I only have a handful of warblers on a feeder, and this is one of them. This is a yellow rump warbler during probably a spring rainstorm, and so the flying insects were minimal, so it landed on this suet and was taking advantage of these fats. But an almost guaranteed way to attract not hummingbirds, but warblers is water. Having fresh water, because while they may not want your food, all birds need fresh water. And I could have put water on all of them, but especially for warblers where you can't really use a lot else to attract them, water is a great way. They will come into water quite regularly because they need it. Like I said, all birds do, so it could have been on all of them, but in particular here. It's not going to be, there's no going to be a special feeder that's going to just attract warblers. They, like I said, they will come in. You put suet out and they need it, they will utilize it. So certain parts of the country, warblers are more regular at suet feeders, especially if you're on their wintering grounds where there are regular cold snaps that prevent flying insects from being up in the air. Well, then you'll more regularly see warblers utilizing suet. So it kind of just depends on where you're at. All right, so wrapping up here, these are last slides here. Just a couple of other things you can do. Obviously, putting up feeders. These are the other big things you can do to help birds as part of your bird feeding journey. Always remember, keep your feeders clean. Clean your bird feeders to prevent disease. Keep your kitties indoors. If you have bird feeders, don't have outdoor cats. That's a bad combination. You're congregating birds and then you're introducing a non-native predator. So keep your kitties inside. If you have your windows near to your bird feeders, put some sort of treatment over your windows. You can see these clear decals. They help the birds to know that it is not more habitat on what they see in that reflection. Instead, it lets them know there is something solid there and they cannot pass through it, and you can prevent window strikes. And then planting native plants only helps to support your bird feeding. So some birds switch, to having a bit more insect in their diet in the summertime, and so native plants host native bugs, and native bugs feed native birds. So complement your feeding with your plants, and along with feeding birds, these are 4 quick and easy things you can do to further help birds. More resources. If you want more resources, I don't have the finch forecast network up here, but if you type in winter finch forecast into Google, it will pop up. So I am sorry I didn't have that in this resources. I forgot to add it on, but Feeder Watch is a great one if you're getting started feeding. Again, if you didn't join last week, watch last week's. We talk about some of these resources in a little bit more depth, but Feeder Watch is a great one. Obviously, WBFI.org has a great resource page for ambassadors. If you want a little smart aleckiness mixed in with your information, my site Flocking Around has some great information as well. All About Birds through Cornell Lab of Ornithology, as well as Ever and Audubon. All great resources to continue learning about your local birds, because as part of your journey to attract birds, you need to learn your local birds, because how they act, in one area versus another is very, very different. So learn your local birds. And if you have questions, obviously you can ask them now. We've got a few minutes left here, but also you can reach out, contact information for WBFI and myself. And if you have a specific question, you can ask and we can see what we can do to help answer it.
Awesome, Zach. We do have a couple questions in the chat. What birds eat Niger and mealworms in Florida?
In Florida. So Florida's going to have, the small-billed finches, American goldfinch, but mealworms, bluebirds. That's, if you're going to use mealworms, and I didn't cover bluebirds in this because regularly attracting them to feeders can be a little bit more of a challenge, but mealworms is a great way to get bluebirds, and you're going to have eastern bluebirds in Florida, and mealworms are a great way. Now, other birds will use mealworms, especially in summertime, because again, they need that animal protein and those macronutrients to help chicks form feathers. So providing mealworms can attract a lot more than those, but a great way to get bluebirds wherever you're at in the country, eastern bluebird, mountain bluebird, western bluebird, mealworms are a great way to do so. And then, yeah, Niger, you've got some small-billed sparrows also that hang out or migrate down into Florida in winter. Depends on what part of Florida you're into. If you're in the Keys, it's a very different ball game. You at least are still going to get American goldfinch and then some small-billed sparrows that will use Niger. Also, you have painted buntings and indigo buntings, and those will both also eat Niger. Although if you have sunflower seed, they will prefer the sunflower seed and things like millet over the Niger. So if you want something like a painted bunting, which is a beautiful bird, it's green and blue and red, sunflower is going to be better than the Niger in that case. So upping your sunflower and your mealworms might do better than Niger, because you have less finch species there than say me here, where I think I've got like 7 species of finch at my house, just right here. And so it's going to depend on what your local birds are. I would say you got a good shot at least to get some small-billed sparrows and then some goldfinch into a Niger feeder.
Great. She said that she's going to just do a separate feeder for black oil sunflower just for her cardinals.
Good idea. And you'll see other birds are going to use it too. Your cardinals will love it, but then you might, especially migration, you might get some buntings coming in. And when those buntings show up, again, depending on where you're at in Florida, some buntings will winter in southern Florida. And researchers, I know I've known some researchers who go to backyards in Florida where feeders are set up because they can catch 17 painted buntings in a single backyard, which is, it's wild, but they're using that supplemental feed provided by backyard bird feeders. So sunflower seed, sunflower seed, you'll notice it was on a lot of those because it is a great catch-all for just attracting a lot of birds because it's got those oils, those fats, those proteins that the birds love.
Awesome. And then our last question is, why does a blue jay tap after eating?
What does it tap?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so it could be a couple of things happening here. So usually when a jay's tapping, it'll grab the seed, it'll fly up, and then what they're actually doing is they're holding it with their feet or they're shoving it into a crack and they're cracking open the shell. But other times what they can be doing is getting grit, where they'll swallow grit to help grind that plant matter in their crop up so that it can digest and the other part of their digestive tract. But it really just depends. But usually what you're seeing, and I know this because I see them doing it all the time, even like with a peanut heart, they'll grab the peanut, they'll fly up, and even though they could swallow it whole, you'll see them, they'll hold it with their feet or they'll shove it into a crack and then they smack it and break it into smaller pieces so it's a little bit easier to swallow, consume and digest. So, I don't know exactly what you're talking about because I can't see what you're envisioning when you ask that question, right? But that is typically what they're doing is breaking open whatever that food is Now, if it's after they swallowed it, they're probably getting grit to help with that, or they also could just be cleaning off their bill, or trying to help that food go down, because they don't have quite the swallowing abilities that mammals have.
Perfect. All right, I am going to switch over to my screen.
Yeah.
Not there. Nope, not there. Maybe. There we go. And I just want to thank you all for attending this webinar. Also, a huge thanks to Zach for sharing his knowledge with us again. Please join us again next week to learn how to identify birds at your feeder and attract birds to new feeders. Make sure to follow Flocking Around and the WBFI on social media to stay in the know on upcoming webinars and events. And lastly, be on the lookout for an email from WBFI with the next steps and tasks to complete before we meet again next week. Thanks again for being here and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.